and call recording is on. And also to reduce your financial loss, because primarily that's what hackers are going after when they're going after you and your families. They're trying to get hands on your information, which can somehow lead them to gain access to your bank account or credit card so that they can take money from you. Next slide. So the focus really for this session is on cybercrime and the ways and things that cyber criminals use to go after you and your families. Next slide. Just some high-level facts. And I always, when I talk to some of these, it's always with a little bit of grain of salt, because some of these facts that you see on here may be distorted a little bit. There's a variety of sources of the information, some of them coming from cybersecurity product vendors that do studies and produce information. So you always got to question it a little bit. But I can tell you, over the last 2 decades, I've seen the cybercrime and the ways that cyber criminals break in grow enormously, exponentially, if you will. So, for example, that global cost of cybercrime, it could be that high. It could be $6 trillion. It could be more. It could be less. But many years ago, we were talking a few $1 billion, and now it's just shooting out beyond all recognition of what the facts are, I think, at this point. A scary factor are the number of malicious software or malware types that are available to criminals. We've seen just in the last year, in 2016, over 142 million new types of malware added to the kit bag that cyber criminals have access to, and that number now exceeds over 600 million. If you think about antivirus software and the things you might run on your computer to help protect you, there is no way that any antivirus software company can keep up with that growing threat. It's just growing too fast for them. So it's important to have those kinds of capabilities on your personal devices, but at the same time, be wary, because they don't stop everything. Lots of records lost and stolen. For those of you that are in small to medium-sized businesses, it used to be maybe a decade ago that the primary targets were national-level entities and large. Now everybody's vulnerable, and small and medium-sized businesses now are up to 65% of all attacks. So at the bottom line is that every one of us is vulnerable to a cyber attack. Every one of us is vulnerable to having our computers or mobile devices breached, and they're going after your information. Next slide. So now I'll get into some of the tips and actions that you can take to protect yourself. At the end of the session, and I know you'll be given these slides separately, there's a 2-page write-up that's kind of tips and tricks to summarize what I'm going to talk about here that'll be available to you, as well as my contact information. So we won't dwell on that, but we'll cover a lot of ground here in the next 35 minutes or so. Next slide. So a lot of cases, you wouldn't think about having policies necessarily on the individual level, but in reality, things that you might do at work and some of the policies you might read or be responsible for in a workplace environment should transcend to the home environment. Because if you have a family, it's important for everybody who has access online to kind of understand some of the challenges that we're facing. I see a note from somebody at the audio feed stopped. Are we still good? Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you, Tim. Hold on. Let me try to hit the button again.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. I think Yeah. Send us a message now if you still can't hear, and we'll try to work on our end. But for now, I think it was just a momentary stop there for a second, Tim. So go ahead.
Okay. So policies. Some of the things I talk about during this session you may want to share with your family members and others that are friends of yours, because in reality, you're setting policy. who can have access online and to what and for what purposes. If you basically use the web without any constraints at all and don't have any security standards applied, and don't go into settings on some of the apps and devices that you use to increase your security and privacy, you're leaving yourself wide open. So it's really important to consider this and establish rules for yourself and others when it comes to the use of the internet, because there's just a lot of danger out there. There's a lot of good. I used to work at Microsoft, and our goal was to, make all those software products available to do all kinds of great things. A lot of value out there. Our world has changed, but at the same time, as the software vendors push out products and capabilities, in a lot of cases, the security is not necessarily built in to any great degree, and they leave us more and more vulnerable individually. Next slide. Firewalls. So one of the basics on any computer device or on any mobile device is that you have a firewall that's normally installed as part of the product when you buy it, and that you have that firewall turned on. Those firewall settings are designed to prevent intrusions from some very restricted locations in the world, perhaps. They're designed to protect you from just major known efforts to break in. But like any wall, they can be breached. And time again, when I talk to customers, they tell me, well, we've got a good firewall and we've got good antivirus software, so we feel 100% confident that we won't have any problems. They're dead wrong. Because all of these defenses have vulnerabilities themselves, and while it's important to have them turned on, at the same time, you can't just rest on that thinking that you're completely safe. Next slide. So you'll see in your screen settings sometimes, potentially that you get some updates that pop up at you, and they're painful. Sometimes they take a lot of time to update your software on your computers, and these updates tend to happen at the worst times when you're right in the middle of doing some work or trying to get something done on a personal level, and then suddenly it pops up and it tells, hey, it's time to do a Windows update. It is absolutely essential to let these updates run, because the way it works is the major software vendors are constantly looking for gaps, vulnerabilities, any problems with their software that need to be fixed. They also track what's going on in the cybercrime arena, identify vulnerabilities that have been exploited, and take fairly quick action to put patches out there to defend those systems to a greater degree. And given the number of malware types I mentioned earlier, it's an ongoing process. It's very important. So for example, with Microsoft software, with your operating system and some of the applications that you use, normally once a week, they will put out an update. And many times that update includes security types of things that are necessary to take the software and to modify the software to defend against some of these new malware types. If you think about it, operating systems like Windows have more than 3 million lines of code, and as a result, there's a tremendous possibility for vulnerabilities in that code despite their best efforts to help you. So let the updates run. I know it's painful, but it's really important to do that. I just ran an update on my iPad and my Apple iPhone a few minutes ago. Security is what they're trying to do is build in extra security to protect you, and it's really important to let it happen. Next slide. Admin versus user accounts. When you pick up a computer out of the box, you often have the opportunity to be an administrator, have administrator rights to that computer. And it also gives you the option to set up a user account. My suggestion is never, ever enter into a computer as an admin. Mainly because admin level gives you access to everything on that computer, to include all the code. And you can make mistakes. You can get into files you shouldn't get into. You can delete things that you shouldn't touch. You can have an impact on your computer operation. I'm getting some feedback, so if you can mute someplace, that'd be helpful. You just don't want to operate in admin mode unless you or yourself are a system administrator and have a great okay? So set up a user account, and when you do that, set up a fairly long and complicated password to get access to your computer, because at least at the minimum, if somebody steals your computer, a long and complicated password will at least better protect you from them potentially breaking in quickly. But use user accounts for your computer systems, and please don't operate an admin role because you can do a lot of bad things to your computer system if you're there. Next slide. So talking about passwords, we all hate them. They're painful, particularly in online sessions that you have with banks and other systems that you use routinely. They're constantly changing the requirements and asking you to put a new password in. And how do you keep track of these darn things? It's a process. The worst password to have is password. Everybody will try that if they're trying to break into your computer. Using your birth dates and your home address and things like that. Anything that's publicly available information on you, and if you use it as a password, they're going to be able to figure that out too. So it's important to establish fairly long passwords for all the different systems that you are required to use a user ID and password to get into. Change them periodically, make them complicated, write them down on a piece of paper someplace. Please don't have a file on your computer that says passwords, because if somebody breaks into your computer, they can get your passwords to all your bank accounts and credit cards and things like that. And although it's a necessary security step to be able to help protect you and your information. Next slide. Emails. There probably isn't any one of you that doesn't live in the world of email every day, sometimes getting hundreds or thousands of them. It's a necessity in life for the most part today. There's a variety of different email types that you can use. The first thing I'd mention is please use a reputable source for emails, like Hotmail or Gmail, things like that, because there are some vendors out there that have really cheap, inexpensive, web-based email systems, but they're not necessarily well protected. They don't have a lot of security designed around them, so my recommendation is to use email capabilities that have been well checked out there, that have a solid corporate backing behind them as a start. Now, emails themselves, I'm sure everybody on the call has gotten a lot of spam. And it's important to let your spam filters run on your phones and on your computer systems. Be very wary of emails that look suspicious, because sometimes when you open them up, or you click on a document, or you go to a web link that's been provided in the email, there's a fairly decent probability that that is just a hacker trying to get you to take that action. And when you open that document or click on a link from a suspicious email, you may be infecting your computer with malware, and they may take control of your computer. Always try to check the email closely before you open it. See, is this coming from somebody that I know or a source that I recognize? If it isn't, be very careful. Particularly things that are considered spam that most of the major software providers help protect you against. You know, I know when I use Hotmail, for example, I get a lot of emails that go into my spam folder, and I do a quick scroll through to see if there's anything in there that looks like it could be coming from somebody real or somebody that I want to communicate with. The delete button is your friend. Eliminate emails that make no sense or that look suspicious, because there's a good probability you've just protected yourself. Next slide. So as kind of a follow-up to the email situation, there's a thing called phishing. Phishing is essentially a hacker's way to gather information about you that they can use against you. It's one of the primary methods today that hackers use to break into corporate networks, to take money, to try and gather information. And by phishing, what happens is they will send you an email that looks very, very real. It could be even coming from your boss or a close friend. but they've managed to gather enough information to make you think that they're sending you something real, and then they ask you to take some kind of action normally. Normally it's to open a document. Sometimes it might be a zip file. Now, zip files are notorious for, planting malware on your computer systems. Could be a Word document. They could be sending you online to some location to fill out a form to provide personal information. And if you're not careful, if you don't look closely at the email, if you're suspicious of it, if you're not suspicious of it, then there's a probability that some bad things will happen. Phishing is leading to an outbreak of what's called ransomware out there on the internet right now. Hundreds of thousands of cases over the last couple of years of ransomware where hackers will gather information, take control of your computer or corporate networks as a result, and then they encrypt hard drives, encrypt servers, encrypt, sometimes they encrypt the active directories on email systems for companies. And then they ask whoever the leader is of that organization or individual to pay bitcoins, a number of bitcoins, to be able to get their data back. And in some cases, when you pay, they're criminals. They don't give you your data back. So phishing attempts are one of the major causes of most breaches out there on the internet today. And as a result, always be very wary of what you're opening up. Take a close look at it. Don't just automatically open every email that you see or click on any link that's provided without thinking first. Next slide. Phone scams are also part of this process. I know I get a couple of calls a day, that are vendors trying to sell me things or opportunities to travel and things like that. There's a possibility that in some of those cases, they are hackers trying to get information from you so that they can use it to break into your systems. So phone scams, while not necessarily computer related, in some cases are, and are just another way for hackers to gather information about you that they can use against you. Next slide. Personal backups. So if you have a laptop or a desktop and you have your personal records on there, your documents, the transactions that you make, your tax files and things like that, it's a really good idea every day or two to store that information, back it up on a separate device. Kind of goes back to that ransomware situation I talked about. In the cases where hackers are able to break in and encrypt your data, if you have your data backed up, you don't have to worry about it. You can reboot your computer, update the operating system, or completely install an updated operating system. Start from scratch on the computer. You still have all your data. But if you don't have your data backed up, then you're vulnerable to that kind of an attack. Backing up your data is also important for a variety of other reasons, one of which is these computers break sometimes. Sometimes things go bad and you end up with a faulty operating system or applications don't work properly. And what you don't want to do is lose the data that you've got on your computer. So backing them up with a simple, inexpensive hard drive is really always a good idea. Next slide. Web searches. All of us use the web, I think. We're out there doing all kinds of work and personal things. And the web, to a large extent, really has changed the way we live and the things that we do and how we operate. At the same time, there's a lot of evil out there on the web. There's a lot of websites that exist that, in some cases, when you go to them, they infect your computer. I know, I'll just give you a personal example. I'm a Green Bay Packer fan, and sometimes Packer games aren't live where I live. I live in North Carolina right now. So in the past, I've had to look online to find sources for the Packer game, which may not be the best places to go on the web to get retransmission. So I'm always very careful because there's a possibility I may be doing some damage to my computer when I do that. A lot of websites are bad, and when you go out there on the web, you're searching around and doing things, just use caution. If a website looks kind of funny, or is suspicious, stay away from it. If you suddenly get a pop-up screen that says, hey, you know, your antivirus software is running bad or you need an update, be wary of that, because the antivirus companies or the software that you use do not transmit like that to you over the web. They will operate directly into that application. So things that pop up that look unusual are generally a sign of potential trouble. And as a result, close that browser, start all over again, maybe go into the browser's system functions and delete all history of your web transactions, because there's a chance that some of these places you might end up going to are going to do you harm. Next slide. Cookies. You may have run into this from time to time where a computer program or website requires you to have cookies working. Cookies essentially are just little small pieces of computer code that help them track you, your location, and in some cases sit on your computer and see all the different places that you go to on the internet for marketing purposes. So there's some, although it really doesn't help you protect your privacy very much, there is some good to cookies, but for the most part, they're potential danger. And there are ways in your settings to adjust that. I think it's on the next slide. We should have a picture that shows, a location in your privacy settings on your operating system. So, for example, you would have the option on your operating system to block cookies from every place, and you can do that, although some of the functions that you may have to carry out might require you to have them turned on. Generally speaking, try to block cookies whenever possible. Ensure that you have your fraudulent website warning turned on, because in some cases that helps through the different mechanisms that the website, the system runners there, they keep track of things and identify potentially bad websites and warn you about them or keep you from going to them. And I recommend every once in a while just clear your history and website data, because in some cases what that'll do is eliminate some of those cookies that are on there, and it's just one more way that you can protect yourself. Next slide. Whenever you go to a website and you're asked to provide financial information, maybe make a payment or to order something online, one thing to look for is you look up in the upper browser, and you can see it on your screen right now. You should see on your screen up in the upper portion up there, https://joinme, etc. for this session today. That S is important. That S means secure. There's some degree of encryption involved. If you go to a website and you make an online payment and provide personal information and it doesn't have the S, there's a fairly decent probability that site is not secure, that site's fraudulent, and all they're trying to do is gather your information. My recommendation, never do business online unless you see that HTTPS up there. A lot of websites you go to don't have the S because it costs a little bit more to run the website. They're adding encryption into that site to protect the site itself, and in some cases to protect the sites against hackers going in and modifying things. So please be wary of that. Whenever you do online financial transactions, make sure that S is there. Next slide. Social networking. Quite a phenomenon. A lot of information shared out there. I know some friends of mine who are on Facebook every day and telling you everything they do, every place they eat, everything about their lives. I hope that they have set up their privacy settings that they're only sharing that with people that they've connected to. They're not leaving that wide open for the rest of the World Wide Web. So one thing to do, if you use social networking, go into the privacy and security settings and protect yourself. I suggest only providing information on those sites to those that you've actually connected to or that you have listed as friends on Facebook or things like that. If you don't do that, that information that you put out there on the web through these different social networking sites is available to everybody. And that means it's available to the hackers out there who are gathering information about people and what they do and where they live, their phone numbers, their email addresses. Their intent is to gather enough information so that they can go after you. And beyond hacking, I mean, there's obviously other potential criminal activities that exist as well. But social networking is a treasure trove of information for hackers, and it's best to use a little bit of caution and ensure that your privacy settings are such that you can protect your information to a greater degree. Also, be wary of people that you connect with through these social networking sites, because in some cases they're not real. I know I had a friend recently who lives over in the UK. I got an instant message from him on Facebook saying, hey, I'm traveling in the Ukraine right now, and his ex-wife was from the Ukraine, so that made some degree of sense. And I'm in trouble and I need some money. Can you contact me and provide me some money? Well, that was an obvious attempt to try and get money from me. And what I did was I called the guy up and I said, are you really in the Ukraine right now? And he said, no. And he said, I'm getting calls from people telling me that that somebody's hacked into my Facebook account and is trying to reap some financial gain from it. So there's just a lot of evil out there, a lot of criminal activity on these sites, and again, use caution. Next slide. Now, when you're sitting at home, it's just you and your family, it's probably not any kind of a requirement for you to lock your screen, although, you know, if you have a bunch of family members and they get on different computers, you know, they may do some things on your computer you don't want. But when you're traveling, when you're out in public, when you're sitting in a coffee shop and you're online, when you walk away from your computer, first make sure you keep an eye on it so somebody doesn't take it. But secondly, lock your screen up. Don't leave it available for somebody to follow up right behind you and start poking around and gathering information. It happens all the time. The other thing I recommend, if you do a lot of traveling with laptops and iPads and devices like that, if there's a way for you to encrypt your data on those devices, it's not a bad idea. For example, I use BitLocker, and essentially encrypts my hard drive on my computer. If somebody were to steal my computer and it had been locked up or turned off, they're not going to get anything out of it. It takes a special piece of computer code that's only provided to law enforcement to be able to get into that BitLocker drive and to get that data. So my recommendation is, when away from the computer, lock up the screen or turn it off. Next slide. You would think that, you know, when you go online, you go to YouTube and you watch videos, or you go to other sources and you're looking at pictures, that you're probably safe. That's not necessarily true either, unfortunately. The criminal elements out there are coming up with new and interesting ways to find ways into your information, and some of that is the videos and pictures you may open on your computer, which could download malicious code into your system. So the first recommendation is use reputable sites like Flickr, YouTube, and some of these other social networking types of systems, because generally they pay attention to that. They do some scanning. They try to identify potentially bad images or video capabilities that are out there that might have some malicious code on them. They don't catch everything, so again, use caution. Next slide. Thumb drives. Probably all of us at one point in time have used thumb drives to be able to download information from one computer to put it on another. I know this morning I had to put a thumb drive into a printer to scan a document, then add it to my computer so I could take that document and send it by email. Thumb drives are a very helpful item, but at the same time, let's say you have a virus or a worm or some kind of malware on your computer, there's a possibility that you can download that malware onto the thumb drive, and when you pass it to somebody else, you put it into a corporate network, that you will infect that network. You'll infect your friend's computer. So ensure that you're only downloading and putting on thumb drives the documents that you've created or that you know are safe. And also be wary of picking up thumb drives for free at conventions and other sources where you're handed these things, because there's a potential, depending on the manufacturer, that there might be some malicious capability on that thumb drive. I know that a couple of years ago, there was a major convention in the United States where a whole bunch of thumb drives were given out for free. They were from a Chinese source, and unfortunately, there was a separate, small, little operating system hidden on that thumb drive so that when one put it into their own computer, the hackers could link up over the internet to that computer, turn on that other operating system, and take complete control. Buy them in stores. Make sure they're from U.S. or, countries like Canada or the U.K. or whatever. Avoid Chinese and Russian products, because there's a possibility that you will have some bad capabilities that you've just purchased or just decided to use. Next slide. Wireless. Wireless is a significant capability that probably all of us use, and at the same time, it can be a real threat. When you're in a home environment, you might have wireless turned on to be able to connect all your devices. When you're at work or in a public place, you have access to wireless capabilities. The first rule of thumb is always use wireless that requires encryption. Always use wireless that requires you to put in a password. If you're using wireless that doesn't require that, anything you do on your computer, on your phone, on your iPad, in that environment is available to anybody else who can connect to that wireless capability. Next slide. So for example, when you're in a train station or an airport or some other busy public place and they offer free Wi-Fi, but they don't require some kind of a password to connect, don't do it. You're basically throwing caution to the wind when you do, because for all you know, there's somebody sitting in that location, scanning for devices, looking for people that are connected to that wireless system. They connect to you, they grab your information, and the next thing you know, you've had your bank account drained. Wireless is your friend, but it's also your enemy. Next slide. One way to avoid this problem is to use a personal secure hotspot. I'm not advocating any particular products here. I just show one, Verizon hotspot. There are capabilities that you might not be aware of that you can use to connect to the internet when there's wireless available, or at least a connection to a cellular capability that would give you that access that will help you avoid using those public Wi-Fi connections. So this is one of them, a Verizon device, very small, that you turn on, you connect to the cellular network. It's got an encryption key built into it, and you can connect your computer, your phone, or other devices to it. Another method, a lot of phones today have the ability to establish a hotspot connected to cellular, and that's another method that you can use to avoid using that public Wi-Fi. Public Wi-Fi is just dangerous. Next slide. Use of the cloud. The cloud is, has been around quite a while, but it's fairly new in terms of from a security perspective, because I'll tell you, the security folks I work with, they're still trying to figure out what are the best ways to secure activity in the cloud. Cloud is essentially just a bunch of data centers out there where data is stored and you access that data through the internet. But it also gives you the capability to have all your documents and other information sitting out there so you can access it from all kinds of different devices. There's a lot of good to it, but at the same time, there are still insecurities in cloud-based operations that we have not overcome. So whenever you use the cloud to store things, to store information, read up a little bit about the company you're connecting to or the type of capability that you're connecting to see if they applied security. Have they had any issues? I know there's a lot of cases out there right now where people are using Amazon Web Services and they haven't turned on all the security. They think they're secure, but they're not. Their data's getting taken. So use the cloud with caution. Next slide. Home network environment. A lot of you probably have this today, where you have connections to the internet and you connect your different devices to it, and you may have a printer at home that's connected with Wi-Fi, all connected to that wireless router. Please ensure that you turn the security on that wireless router. Use the encryption that's built into it. And require that any device being connected to that wireless router has to use that password to gain access. If you turn the encryption off, you've basically created a wireless location that's just like public Wi-Fi that anybody can access. Next slide. Let's talk a little bit more about devices. I know sitting on my desk right now, I've got my laptop, I've got my iPad, and I've got my cell phone. Each one of these devices has security settings and privacy settings that when you go into them and you check them out, you need to make some decisions on what you can do to protect yourself. If you pull them out of the box, start using them, and don't ever go into settings to take a look at what's there and turn some things on and off, you're just leaving yourself wide open. So it's important to get to know these devices, to look at those settings, to see what your options are. And if you have questions, go online. Learn about them. There are most reputable companies that sell these kinds of things to you, provide you some capabilities to protect yourself, and it's important to learn and to use them. At the same time, the source of these devices is always a concern. There was a report just today where the U.S. intelligence community recommended that Americans do not buy and use, I'm going to probably mispronounce this, Huawei, H-U-A-W-E-I, phones, cell phones, because they're built in China, and there have been a lot of insecure types of activities going on with these types of phones. So sometimes buying something cheap, buying something secondhand, without looking at the brand and the reputation of the company selling it to you can be a danger. So again, use common sense, learn about the devices that you're purchasing, and get into those settings and take some action to better defend yourself against these potential attacks and breaches. Next slide. Mobile apps. I know on my phone right now I probably have 50 to 60 different applications on there. The ones I trust are generally the ones from my banking accounts that require me to use a thumbprint and or a password or both to be able to gain access to take action. My email I trust because it again requires a password connection. In some cases there's security around it if it's a corporate network. But most of the other apps you can download and use on the phone have no security built in at all. Those who are trying to sell those apps to you, when they build the apps, their whole desire is to get them out there, make them readily available to the public, to sell them, or to sell things through them. And they're not necessarily governed by any good security practices when they build these applications. And as a result, they're potentially insecure for use. Gaming systems. Many gaming systems online or through applications on phones are notorious for having no security at all and leave their users vulnerable to attack. So whenever you're adding applications to your devices or to your phones, maybe check them out a little bit and see if there is any security embedded in them, because potentially one of those applications, when used, could provide a route for a hacker to get into your data. Next slide. Internet of Things, fairly new term, but it applies to what could amount to billions and billions of devices over the next 5 to 10 years that are available to the public to do lots of interesting things using the internet. For example, some of these new automobiles that are coming out have Internet of Things devices on them so that you can do things from afar to connect to your car. Or you can be at work and you can connect by an Internet of Things device to your house to turn lights on and off or to check on things. There's a lot of good in these devices, but at the same time, there's not necessarily any security built into them. And I'll tell you what, for those of us in the cybersecurity world, it's causing just all kinds of problems for us because these are just, every one of these devices is a potential entry point for a hacker. Next slide. Simple example, Winnie. So you've got this baby monitor in your house. It's got a camera. It connects to the internet. And from a distance or from downstairs, you can hook into this thing and you can monitor activity. There have been cases where hackers have found Winnie, the IP address that's built into Winnie, and have entered home computer systems and in some cases corporate networks through Winnie. Use caution. At the same time, we had a really interesting case where a Las Vegas casino had an Internet of Things device attached to a fish tank. It was designed to monitor the temperature in the fish tank and to turn on and turn off feeding cycles for the fish in the tank. Hackers found that device, broke into it, from that found their way into the corporate network and into the gaming system and stole millions of dollars. These devices are, in some cases, very helpful, but at the same time, use caution. Next slide. Home printers and work printers. These are great entry points for hackers. They love them. In our case, in one corporation that we got into, we just found a printer that was unsecured over the internet, just happened to be connected to the CEO's laptop. From the CEO's laptop, we found our way into the corporate servers. In the corporate servers, we found all the password files for every employee. And in that particular case, unfortunately, we were able to find password files to about 100 other companies. Printers are great sources of entry. If you're going to use them wirelessly, ensure you have the encryption turned on. Require a password to connect to that device. If you leave that password off, you're just leaving yourself open as another entry point. The other thing you need to remember is that with printers in general, any documents you print or scan, there's memory built into these printers, and it stores that information until they're turned off and turned back on again. So if a hacker breaks into that, they're going to be able to gather data from that buffer memory that's in that printer. Next slide. Kind of to sum up a little bit, there's a fairly high probability you're going to get hacked. I know in my case, even though I've been in cybersecurity for years, I've had my bank account information taken several times, which has cost me some money over the years. And it's just going to happen, despite what you may do to protect yourself. In a lot of cases, when you think you've been hacked, it may be a good idea to take that computer into a computer shop, have it completely redone, have the operating system reloaded. Hopefully you've taken the step to back up your data. If you think you've been hacked and some funny screens start to pop up when you're on the internet, hit Alt Control Delete and close that program down. Try to stop that activity. It's a hard problem, and there aren't many companies out there that focus on individuals that have been hacked. Generally speaking, those of us in the cybersecurity business, we're really focused on corporate networks and government networks because they have money to pay us to do what we do. But if you think you've been hacked, maybe from another source, go online and see if you can learn about what you're seeing on the computer. There'll potentially be some tips out there as to how to counter it. And in the worst case, find a computer pro and go to them to get some help, because there's a chance that everybody on this call will be hacked at one point in time. So at this point, I guess we'll open it up for questions. If you go to the next slide, so we've got the Q&A slide up there. Let me just show you real quick. Slides following that. There's the first page of that cyber tips. There's a second page of the cyber tips. There's and then there's my contact information at the end, and you'll have that available to you. So at this point, let's open up the floor to questions.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Tim, for that. I appreciate you taking the time today, and really useful tips there. And of course, everybody may be wondering, part of the reason we had Tim today was, first of all, to scare you to death so you don't do anything. But in all seriousness, It's some scary stuff out there, but our goal, too, is to make it to where you're not the lowest hanging fruit out there. Maybe make it difficult for the hackers to get to you, and so we hope that that's what we're accomplishing today, although it is also kind of scary sometimes, too. But, Tim, what I will do is I'll just go through a couple things real quick, and I just want to get out a couple financial specific ways to protect yourself, and then we'll see if we have any questions. But like we talked yesterday, especially for our Schwab account holders, a couple of the things that we recommend you do is firstly for your Schwab accounts, make sure you have account access, log on, and password information, and then call Schwab and tell them you want to use your voice as a password. We think this is a really good procedure to use there. Also, there's an app that you can download. We try to tell everyone whenever we get a chance, download the VIP Access app on your phone, and again, you'll have to call Schwab to coordinate this. But what happens is once you enter your username into your Schwab account, you'll access this app. It will create a random 6-digit code that goes on at the end of your password, but essentially makes your password different every time you log in. And again, if you need to call into Schwab for any reason, they will allow you to use your voice as your password when you're communicating with them to further protect you. You mentioned BitLocker, and we talked about that a little bit yesterday as well. That is really helpful. Also, we use a program called LastPass. I think there are others out there. And let me be clear that they're not, I don't believe they're more convenient. I'm not going to go that far. And there is a little bit of a learning curve. So it's going to take a little bit of effort. But once you learn how to use LastPass, and we can help with that a little bit, we believe, and Tim, I think you do too, that your passwords are higher quality, more digits, more different characters, harder to hack, and then you can change them more often, and LastPass helps you manage that process. And it's probably, I would say, nearly impossible to have the complex passwords that we have without some kind of software like that. Finally, use double authentication wherever possible. A lot of these, your banks and apps or secure things will send you a code or allow you to put your fingerprint into your phone to authenticate yourself. It's always a good measure to do. And I think that's all I wanted to cover. And Tim, you said it best yesterday when we were talking. You said in all cases, you've got to do your homework. That's kind of what it boils down to. We can't be lazy with this. We have to research. Right now, we're looking into ID monitoring services. We currently use Experian. We want to make sure they're the right ones, and there's plenty out there, and there's some good ones as well. So we do recommend those. But Tim, there's a couple of questions coming in, but before I hand it over or read some of the questions, I was wondering myself, what do you think about the cameras on our iPads? I know some people are concerned about that. Is that something you've heard of, or is that a threat at all to us?
Well, believe it or not, it is.
Mm-hmm.
If hackers have broken into your iPad or your phone in some way, there are ways with computer technology for them to turn your camera on but not show you visibly that it's on. Now, that's an extreme case. I mean, most of us as individuals, the probability that somebody's going to try and break in that way is low. But, let's say you've got a job where you work in a sensitive location, or for a company that they're targeting, they might do that because there are techniques that are used by folks either in the spy business or in the criminal business where they can turn those cameras on and see what's going on just based on that computer or that device that's sitting there. Generally speaking, I leave my camera off unless I'm in a Skype session or something with somebody, and that's the only time I turn it on. But there are just so many ways in. And cameras, whatever a camera can see, if it can be turned on remotely, and it can be, whatever it sees, it can gather information.
Yeah. Kevin has a question, and this is one we talk about a lot within our own firm, and you guys have helped us a little bit with. But what are more specifically about passwords, how often do you recommend changing them? How many digits? How should they be made up? And why is it important to have more than just 8 characters, I guess I should say?
Yeah, I think one of the things you see out there, industry standard-wise, with bank accounts and others, is that they're looking at 8 to 10 characters as a minimum, that there's a combination of capital letters, small letters, numbers, and things like exclamation points or asterisk, special characters. The whole intent is you want to make it a little bit more complicated for a hacker to be able to guess your password. In our business, we use password cracking software. And if you have simple passwords, generally speaking, when we run that on a system, we can find the password in a couple minutes. More complicated passwords may take hours. There is no password that can't be broken. But the whole intent is you want to make it as hard as possible for somebody to steal your information. And when you tie your passwords to things that are pieces of information that are readily available publicly about you, there's a good chance they're going to figure it out. So make your password as long as possible. Use a variety of characters and small and capital letters and numbers in it. Maybe write it down on a piece of paper that you store in a desk drawer. But 8 to 10 characters is a minimum, is probably the standard to go after, if not longer. But better than passwords, and you mentioned it, it's 2-factor or 3-factor authentication. Any system that requires you to use not only a password but maybe a thumbprint or an iris scanner or some kind of biometric to be able to gain access is much better. A good example are our credit cards and ATM cards today. Most of us have cards now that have chips on them, and when you go to buy something, you have to insert that card into the system rather than swiping it. That insertion, that chip, is a second factor of authentication now. It shows the card reader that there's a high probability that the actual owner of that card is putting it into the reader, and if it requires you to put in a PIN, you have to have both the card and the PIN to be able to make the financial transaction. So that's 2-factor authentication. In the past, when you were using just the swipe of the card, those were being copied. Criminals had ways to attach little devices to those card readers, and every time a card was swiped, they would gather all the data that was on that magnetic strip, and then they could go back and create a card, clone a card with all that information, and they had your credit card. And I know in my case, that's happened to me in the past. So that 2-factor authentication using there, that's an example of going beyond passwords. Some places that you go into online might require you to identify a picture, pick a picture, and then that picture should show up every time you have access to your account, plus you put in a password. Those are examples of trying to defeat some of the main methods used by hackers to break in.
Awesome, thank you. And just a reminder, we got a couple minutes left for questions. But if you have one later, you don't want to ask it in this format, just obviously feel free to follow up with an email to myself or Kevin, and we can get Tim to help us out as well later. So email or phone call anytime if you have questions that you don't think of or you don't have right now. A couple things in the last couple minutes we have is one more question. But first, sometimes, Tim, we don't think about the simple things too. Like Kevin and I were just talking earlier today about how important, I guess in the office world it's called the clean desk policy, where you don't leave papers around. Personally, I would think it would be beneficial to have a scanner, have a shredder, scan documents, put them in a secure file, and then shred those so that they're not around. And that's something we often don't associate with the cyber world, but that's often how they get information too. The other thing I would like you to comment on with our time remaining is we travel a lot. A lot of people on this call travel a lot too. And sometimes, I think it was you or Nick may have mentioned, when you put you're charging your device in the airport, that there's actually a risk, again, another risk, of putting your USB port charger into the charging outlet versus plugging in. Is that something that you all were talking about, or I read somewhere else, or is there any credit to that?
Yeah, no, this is kind of getting into the graduate level of hacking, but it was mentioned at the beginning that I used to be with the National Security Agency. I can tell you that the spy agencies out there have come up with, over many, many years, all kinds of interesting ways to gather information. And believe it or not, these electrical circuits that we depend on, there are ways within which elements, criminal elements or others who have learned some of the tricks of the trade, that they can actually monitor and gather information via electronic emissions. That is a possibility. It's fairly low risk, I think, because it's very sophisticated, that method of intrusion. But if you just happen to be unfortunate to be in a surrounding where somebody has that capability and they've applied it into the area where they're working, like a public place in an airport or what have you, there's a possibility that they can connect to your device through that electronic emission and gather information or suck all the data out of your phone or your laptop while you're charging it. It's unfortunate, but there are lots of ways in.
Yeah, that's a scary one too. But is it true that if you plug in versus a USB port, there's a difference there? Is that the statement?
Yeah, I'm not sure about that. I'd have to check on that.
Yeah.
I think the method really goes back to the electronic emission types of activities, and I'm not sure it makes a lot of difference.
Okay. All right.
They're using, but Nick may be a better source for that, but I know the world I came out of, the intelligence world I came out of, we used electronic emissions in a lot of interesting ways.
Yeah. Wow. Well, that pretty much takes us to the hour point, and Tim, once again, thank you so much for taking the time, and thank you to all of you that joined the call, and again, feel free to follow up with an email or phone call if you think of questions after this. We will also make this available on our website. Like I said, it will take us a few days to get it up on the website to convert the file. Again, thank you for your time. Thank you, Tim, and that's the end of our call today.
All right, super. Thanks a lot, everybody.
Okay, bye-bye.